Good morning and welcome to part two of One Acadiana's Ballots Over Breakfast programming. I'm Andre Bro and I work on the team at One Acadiana. And as you know, early voting is now underway for the December 5th election. It's going to be open today, tomorrow, then closed for Thanksgiving and Friday, and then open again on Saturday. And then the election itself is December 5th. And One Acadiana makes it a priority to educate the public on upcoming elections. In fact, this is our 5th year of hosting Ballots Over Breakfast programming with Steve Procopio at PAR and other issue experts. So we thank Steve again for being with us, and we also thank Christian Mader at The Current for being with us for today's event. Thank you also to our partners at the 705, Lafayette's Young Professionals Organization, for helping to promote today's event and provide information about the upcoming election. While we're not able to serve you breakfast for today's Ballots Over Breakfast event, we do hope you are able to pick up some breakfast to go from a local restaurant, maybe one of One Acadiana's member restaurants. We're gonna start today with Steve to cover the statewide constitutional amendment on the ballot. I didn't realize until I was reviewing my own sample ballot that there was a constitutional amendment on the ballot. So Steve's going to talk about that. And then Christian's going to go over some propositions that are specific to the city of Lafayette. And I didn't realize that a couple of those were on the ballot either until I looked at my sample ballot. So I think this should be very informative for everyone. As you have questions as we go, please enter them through the Q&A box, and then we'll make some time for Q&A once we go over the issues. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Steve Procopio from PAR.
Thank you so much, Andre. I always enjoy Ballots Over Breakfast. It's a great thing that y'all put on, and I love being involved with it. So the good news is you get a bonus constitutional amendment. So it's like, one for free. This is one, it's sort of out of sequence in terms of normally there'd be one big election. This actually came out of the special session that wrapped up in October. So it was passed too late to actually get on the sort of regular November ballot. It's relatively simple as compared to the ones we had before, where they're not a crunchy constitutional amendment dealing with property tax or anything like that. It's really the makeup of the management college boards. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the LSU system, the UL system, the Southern system, and the community and technical colleges. We're not talking about the overall Board of Regents. Those boards are composed, they have 15 members, 15 voting members, not counting the student members. That's 2 from each of the 6 congressional districts, which makes 12, plus then 3 at-large members. And that is at large from the state, or from the state at large is sort of how it's written. There was a very generous and involved alumni at LSU, Lod Cook. He brought 3 presidents to LSU. He was a very influential guy. He did a lot for LSU. There's a lot of buildings named for him on the campus, but he couldn't serve as a board member, even though he's very successful and would have, in the eyes of the author, been a very good member. He passed away in September, so this is a bill that sort of honors his memory. Basically, it would allow 2 of those 3 at-large board members to be from outside of the state. It wouldn't have to be. It just from recommendation of those management boards could be up to those 2. It can never be all 3. I mean, it doesn't have to be any of them. The arguments are pretty simple on both sides. This would open up the board to more people. That would be add more diversity of viewpoint, has a greater pool of members. You can get someone, and also, it's probably good for fundraising as well. So that's really, so the arguments for. And the arguments against, that there's no requirement that these people be alumni, even though Lod Cook is really this sort of example. It doesn't have to be that way. And then, this, you could argue that this really should have been broader reform in that it just should have put all of the memberships should have been in the outside of the Constitution and put in statute instead. Instead, it just sort of tweaks in the Constitution to allow these additional things. So it's fairly straightforward. It's just changing, allowing out-of-state members to serve on these management boards.
I think what was most surprising to me about this one was the timing of it.
Right.
Is there a particular reason why it was passed in the special session and put on the ballot in December?
I think coming out of the special session is following up on Lod Cook's death. He was a Baton Rouge senator who pushed the amendment. And so for the timing, I know they went back and forth on whether or not it would be this December or maybe next April. The thing is, there's no real statewide races for another 2 years. And so you're not going to have, when this year's, since the most recent presidential election, there won't be another one. There won't be one next year. So you have to wait the next year. And so you have to get to 2022 before there'd be another statewide race. I think the thought was that there was going to be a runoff at the Senate election for Senator Cassidy, but he won outright. And so in terms of cost, we actually went and contacted the Secretary of State's office. The whole election is going to cost $6 million, but it turns out there's runoffs on almost every parish except for, I think, 4. And so the actual additional cost is only $376,000, according to the Secretary of State. So we're going to be a lot of elections anyway. Like they're going to be in Lafayette, that are going to happen anyway. It's the same Baton Rouge, New Orleans. There are just ballot elections, tax elections, things like that. So, this isn't a statewide election. It's going to cost us a little extra money, but it's in the hundreds of thousands, not millions of dollars, because we're having a non-statewide race. At PAR, we normally like to suggest to them that they pass their constitutional amendments when there are other statewide elections, just to save money, especially if it's not necessarily urgent. We do encourage that.
Well, and there's no additional cost in Lafayette Parish because we do have some other races on the ballot here. And Christian Mader with the current is going to talk about some of those. We're going to start with 2 sales tax propositions, and they're parallel propositions. So I have one slide that covers both of them. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the City Marshal's race.
Morning, everyone. This is a thrill for me. I love talking civics before 9 o'clock in the morning. It's the former substitute teacher in me, I guess. As Andre pointed out, these appear as 2 separate items on your ballot, but they're really the same basic proposition. And I wrote about this on the current last week, and I was kicking myself this morning because I thought of an even better way of kind of thinking about this. I think that's way easier. So true to form, the legalese on the ballot is pretty confusing. So if you were to go in there cold, you probably wouldn't really know what they were talking about. And one of the words that would trip you up is the fact they call this a rededication, right? And in a technical sense, it absolutely is. But maybe an easier way of thinking about it is actually an undedication, right? So basically what's happening here is you have 2 1-penny sales taxes that the city of Lafayette uses to fund both basic operations, so police, fire, salaries, employee salaries, those kinds of things, and capital improvements. And the way these things work is they get split up. When they were passed originally, they split up such that you had a certain cap of capital improvement. A certain cap of how much you could spend on, say, flexible things, right? So right now, an easy way to think about it is you have about, you have 35% of it is undedicated, meaning like, you take one tax that generates $40 million, or let's make it easy, $100 million. Well, you can spend 35 million of it on those undedicated discretionary expenses like police salaries, fire salaries, those kinds of things from year to year. And the rest of it has to go to capital improvements, either through what's called a pay-as-you-go program, literally paying cash on those improvements, or through bonds, and of course, taking care of any debt, existing debt you already have on those bonds. So what this proposition does, and again, it's on both of them, is it raises the amount of that tax that is undedicated. So they call it a rededication because they're rededicating the original purpose, meaning these things were passed originally many years ago for capital improvement specifically, but they're raising that cap and undedicating more money. right? So one way of thinking about this is about between the two taxes, you get about $80 million a year. And I'm using the 2019 year to derive that figure because obviously 2020 is a little unusual. So when you do the math, it basically frees up about $8 million a year between the two taxes that could then go to the general fund, right? And the general fund, in case you're not aware, is sort of that checkbook that city government has to take care of basically anything that they're legally allowed to spend money on, right? Like this is their discretionary pool. Some people might call it a reserve, but it's really the operating fund of city government. And in our case, it's actually the operating fund of all of consolidated government. So what that means is when they're writing checks, right, their cash flow actually comes through that operating budget. Doesn't mean that we're spending city money on parish things in this case, but it does mean that when we're talking about making sure that money passes through the government to get paid, to get people paid and expenses paid, they operate out of this fund. So this gives them a lot more flexibility is the argument, especially when you're dealing with a major cataclysm like a global pandemic or something like that, right? Like that, if you're forced into a situation where you have to get creative with your funding or you lose a lot of money, then this frees up the money that they have to be able to be more strategic with it is essentially the argument. So there are two taxes that are on here. One's the 1961, so that's how long the tax has been in place, and a 1985 penny. So when you look at this, it'll say 1961, 1985. There are two different amounts. The 1961 tax, if you look on the ballot, I think says, covers $43 million a year. And then the 1985 is 36 or 37. My figures could be a little bit off, but the difference between them is that the 1985 tax was passed with exemptions in it. So, it's not that one penny is not applied to things like groceries and medicine, whereas the 1961 tax is covering everything. But otherwise, these taxes so these propositions are identical. So why would you vote for it? I mean, the argument would be flexibility, right? This gives them the ability to do what they need if their revenues ebb and flow, which they absolutely do, even in good years, right? So sales taxes tend to be more volatile than property taxes. And it gives them the ability to make sure that budget shortfalls when it comes to things like salaries or floating expenses are easier cared for. It's worth noting that just because they put it into the general fund doesn't mean that it won't go to capital improvements. And in fact, that often does happen. They can still do that. It basically gives them budget to work with, right? And the city budget, by contrast to the parish budget, it works primarily out of that major general fund. There's not nearly as many dedicated taxes in there. So why wouldn't you? Well, some people argue that dedicated taxes are the best way to sort of keep government honest, that, we passed this to pay for roads and bridges and drainage. So you're going to spend this on roads and bridges and drainage, right? And, you can actually see a case in public policy, contrast the public policy between the way the parish government is run and the city government is run. Parish government is basically all dedicated taxes. The city government is relatively few dedicated taxes. So people would argue that, look, I want this money to be spent on what it went for. I mean, I've heard people ask, would this affect your bond rating, right? If you allow more flexibility, and the reality is no. Really what they're looking at is debt coverage. So how much money do you have versus your outstanding debts? And the coverage ratio in the city of Lafayette is very good. This is not going to change that. But again, it comes down to how do you think government should operate, right? And it's really a matter of perspective. Do you think it's better to sort of keep those channels as defined as they are, or do you want some flexibility? So that's really what it comes down to with these two items.
And I should say here, the ballot language too is longer than what you see on the slide. I abbreviated it, and where there are the ellipses, there is some language in there about satisfying all bond obligations first, ensuring that the bond obligations are satisfied. Also on the ballot, we do have some runoffs, particularly everyone in the city of Lafayette will be voting in the City Marshal's runoff. And one of the big questions I know you've gotten about this race is, what exactly does the City Marshal do? And you have an explainer out on the current website. And if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, when this race was coming up and I thought about this a little bit, I mean, we generally try as best we can to come up with ways to talk about what are the issues that face any agency and kind of cover races from that perspective rather than the sort of the horse race as they do in national politics. And the first challenge that I had is like, wait, do people really know what the city marshal's office does? So if you're going to say what do you think the city marshal ought to do, or what do you want in a city marshal, people kind of have to have some idea what the city marshal does. And so we polled people. We found about half of our readership didn't really know what the city marshal does. And when I talked to interim marshal Mike Hill, he wasn't surprised by it. Chief Deputy Phil Conrad wasn't surprised by it. And the reason is because the city marshal's office, is, I think Mike Hill kind of put it really, really well, does not have a big public face, but is a big public function, right? So primarily, the easiest way to think about what they do is with respect to the business of city court, right? Which mostly handles misdemeanors, but also has a very active civil docket, small claims court, and things like that. So their primary job is to execute that business. The same way that the sheriff's office is sort of the enforcement arm of district court, city marshal's office is the enforcement arm of city court. So you can break down their priorities into three basic functions. They secure the building, literally make sure, keep it safe, right? They serve civil orders, so things like eviction notices, judgments. They serve warrants, make sure that people show up in court. And then I already said that, but they serve and execute warrants. So you kind of think about those things as orders, on the civil side and orders on the criminal side. Phil Conrad, the ex-chief deputy, told me one thing people don't maybe realize at the city marshal's office is like, if we are showing up, nobody called us, right? Like that generally speaking, they're an unwelcome presence when it comes to what they do. They are a little different, even though they have the same powers as say, any sort of police officer. They can make arrests, they can make traffic stops, these kinds of things. They don't really do that. Most of what their function is getting people to show up to court and making sure that the service and process of those court filings are done. And there's thousands of these things done a year. We have two candidates on this ballot. I can tell you just from talking to folks in law enforcement, I think there's a general sense that they're both qualified for the position. Kip Giudice has run for it before. Reggie Thomas is a former longtime veteran with the Lafayette Police Department, was one time interim police chief and then deputy chief, is a position that doesn't exist anymore. So, generally when you're looking at this race, right, we're not talking about what they're going to do. We're going to talk about how they're going to do it. And I think the way that they've contrasted each other at this point, to the extent they really can, right, is Kip has talked a lot about this idea of using text messages to alert people about their court dates. This is a real issue. Something about 70 to 80% of missed court dates in city court are because people just don't remember. They get these tickets and then 3 or 4 months later is when their court date is. And so, their feeling is, look, if it does no real good for people to get arrested for having missed something that they just kind of forgot about. It's funny, it's like I got in a car wreck not long ago, actually a not misdemeanor summons, but I have a court summons on my desk because I'm challenging the ticket. And this thing is in January and my accident was in September, to kind of illustrate the point. So that's kind of his big talking point, is he feels like this would expedite the work of city court. Reggie Thomas founded a community relations board at the Lafayette Police Department. And so he's pushing that as a thing that he wants to bring to the marshal's office. And again, I think that has a lot to do with where we are just as a country and dealing with law enforcement generally. But it's important to note that the way the marshal's office work, they don't really do beat police work, right? They're not out on the streets necessarily. It doesn't mean they don't do real police work. And in fact, they're on warrant task force. They chase down violent criminals and things like that. They work with the U.S. Marshal's Office from time to time. And I'm told they actually have a very good warrant division, very active and good warrant division. So that's generally how the office runs and what it does. And those are the issues that we're kind of seeing bubble up in this race.
Thank you. And you have more information too on the current LA.com about both candidates and the full explainer, both on the City of Lafayette sales tax propositions and the role of the city marshal. So check out those resources, the current LA.com, and then PAR has their guide to the one constitutional amendment on this ballot at parlouisiana.org. So check that out as well on their website. We do have about 10 more minutes or a little less than 10 minutes for questions right now of either of our panelists. So if you do have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A box. I haven't seen any questions come through so far, which I think means that y'all did a great job explaining the issues, and two, that they're really not as complicated as they may seem at first when you read the ballot language. It is a little overwhelming the first time you see the ballot language, I think. But once you understand what the issue is, it seems a lot more straightforward. So I think y'all may have satisfied everyone on this call, and I think they know what they're voting on now. We are gonna post the video from today's session on One Acadiana's website. We'll share it out with all the participants, and we'll have the slide deck as well posted on our website. Do y'all have any concluding comments? We might have had one question come in, just a thank you. So do y'all have any concluding comments before we wrap up?
Look, I think it's great that people will take time out of their morning to learn about these sort of, fairly, relatively small compared to a presidential election ballot. So I think that's just wonderful and reflects well on One Acadiana and the people that turn in. It's great, and I love being involved in this.
Yeah, I feel like I'll be preaching to the choir here. These are the folks that decided to show up to a discussion of local ballot races on a Tuesday morning. But to me, what I like to preach all the time is, these are the things that do have a huge impact in your day-to-day life, right? People get real frustrated about how their votes don't count when they're dealing with a presidential election, or they feel like, Congress doesn't do anything and they get in gridlock. It doesn't get more direct in terms of democracy than, voting on a tax proposition, right? And understanding how these things impact things that matter to you, right? And, this is the kind of thing that 2 years from now, if there's a fiscal crisis and you're like, what happened? You might point back at this moment and say, well, I could have actually made a difference. And so, these things are really, really important, and kudos to all you guys for being here to talk about it.
Well, thank you both for being with us and explaining the issues. Thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks to the 705. I saw Roddy Bergeron chatted in. A thank you. So thanks to the 705 for your partnership in promoting this event and always providing information about the elections to your members in the community. And as we prepare to vote, it's important to engage experts like you. It's important to share the information out, which was the purpose of today's event. So please do go vote. I will probably be early voting today. So if you go early vote today downtown, I might see you there. It's open today, tomorrow, closed Thursday and Friday, and then open again on Saturday. And if you miss early voting, the election itself is on December 5th. Thank you all again for being with us, and please stay safe.